Chapter 6 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Reminiscent Night. On the ninth morning we made our second start from the Indian Lakes. An amusing incident occurred during the last night of our camp at these waterholes. Coyotes had been hanging around our camp for several days, and during the quiet hours of the night these scavengers of the plain had often ventured in near the wagon in search of scraps of meat or anything edible. Rod Wheat and Ash Borrowstone had made their beds down some distance from the wagon, and the coyotes, as they circled round the camp, came near their beds, and in sniffing about awoke Borrowstone. There was no more danger of attack from these cowards than from field mice, but their presence annoyed Ash, and as he dared not shoot, he threw his boots at the varmints. Imagine his chagrin the next morning to find that one boot had landed among the banked embers of the campfire and was burned to a crisp. It was looked upon as a capital joke by the outfit, as there was no telling when we would reach a store where he could secure another pair. The new trail, after bearing to the westward for several days, turned northward, paralleling the old one, and a week later we came into the old trail over 100 miles north of the Indian Lakes. With the exception of one 30-mile drive without water, no fault could be found with the new trail. A few days after coming into the old trail, we passed Mason, a point where trail herds usually put in for supplies. As we passed during the middle of the afternoon, the wagon and a number of the boys went into the burg. Quince Forrest and Billy Honeyman were the only two in the outfit for whom there were any letters, with the exception of a letter from Lovell, which was common property. Never having been over the trail before, and not even knowing that it was possible to hear from home, I wasn't expecting any letter, but I felt a little twinge of homesickness that night when Honeyman read us certain portions of his letter, which was from his sister. Forrest's letter was from a sweetheart, and after reading it a few times he burnt it, and that was all we ever knew of its contents, for he was too foxy to say anything, even if it had not been unfavorable. Borrowstone swaggered around camp that evening in a new pair of boots, which had the Lone Star set in filigree work in their red tops. At our last camp at the lakes, the Rebel and I, as partners, had been shamefully beaten in a game of 7-up by Bull Durham and John Officer, and we had demanded satisfaction in another trial around the fire that night. We borrowed McCann's lantern, and by the aid of it and the campfire had an abundance of light for our game. In the absence of a table, we unrolled a bed and sat down Indian fashion over a game of cards, in which all friendship ceased. The outfit, with the exception of myself, had come from the same neighborhood, and an item in Honeyman's letter causing considerable comment was a wedding which had occurred since the outfit had left. It seemed that a number of the boys had sparked the bride in times past, and now that she was married, their minds naturally became reminiscent over old sweethearts. "The way I make it out," said Honeyman, in commenting on the news, "is that the girl had met this fellow over in the next county while visiting her cousins the year before. My sister gives it as a horseback opinion that she'd been engaged to this fellow nearly 8 months. Girls, you know, savvy each other that way. Well, it won't affect my appetite any if all the girls I know get married while I'm gone." "You certainly have never experienced a tender passion," said Fox Quarternight to our horse wrangler, as he lighted his pipe with a brand from the fire. "Now I have. That's the reason why I sympathize with these old beaux of the bride. Of course I was too old to stand any show on her string, and I reckon the fellow who got her ain't so powerful much, except his veneering and being a stranger, which was a big advantage. To be sure, if she took a smile to this stranger, no other fellow could check her with a 3/4 rope and a snubbing post. I've seen girls walk right by a dozen good fellows and fawn over some scrub. My experience teaches me that when there's a woman in it, it's haphazard pot luck with no telling which way the cat will hop. You can't play any system, and merit cuts little figure in general results." "Fox," said Durham, while Officer was shuffling the cards, Your auger seems well oiled, and working keen tonight. Suppose you give us that little experience of yours in love affairs. It will be a treat to those of us who have never been in love, and won't interrupt the game a particle. Cut loose, won't you?" "It's a long time back," said Quarternight meditatively, "and the scars have all healed, so I don't mind telling. I was born and raised on the border of the Blue Grass region in Kentucky. I had the misfortune to be born of poor but honest parents, as they do in stories. No hero ever had the advantage of me in that respect. In love affairs, however, it's a high card in your hand to be born rich. The country around my old home had good schools, so we had the advantage of a good education. When I was about 19, I went away from home one winter to teach school, a little country school about 15 miles from home. But in the old States, 15 miles from home makes you a dead rank stranger. The trustee of the township was shucking corn when I went to apply for the school. I simply whipped out my peg and helped him shuck out a shock or two while we talked over school matters. The dinner bell rang, and he insisted on my staying for dinner with him. Well, he gave me a better school than I had asked for, better neighborhood, he said, and told me to board with a certain family who had no children. He gave his reasons, but that's immaterial. They were friends of his, so I learned afterwards. They proved to be fine people. The woman was one of those kindly souls who never know where to stop. She planned and schemed to marry me off in spite of myself. The first month that I was with them, she told me all about the girls in that immediate neighborhood. In fact, she rather got me unduly excited, being a youth and somewhat verdant. She dwelt powerful heavy on a girl who lived in a big brick house which stood back of the road some distance. The girl had gone to school at a seminary for young ladies near Lexington, studied music and painting, and was way up on everything. She described her to me as black-eyed with raven tresses, just like you read about in novels. Things were rocking along nicely when a few days before Christmas a little girl who belonged to the family who lived in the brick house brought me a note one morning. It was an invitation to take supper with them the following evening. The note was written in a pretty hand, and the name signed to it. I'm satisfied now it was a forgery. My landlady agreed with me on that point. In fact, she may have mentioned it first. I never ought to have taken her into my confidence like I did, but I wanted to consult her, showed her the invitation, and asked her advice. She was in seventh heaven of delight and had me answer it at once. Accept the invitation with pleasure and a lot of stuff that I never used before. She had been young once herself. I used up 5 or 6 sheets of paper in writing the answer, spoilt one after another, and the one I did send was a flat failure compared to the one I received. Well, the next evening, when it was time to start, I was nervous and uneasy. It was nearly dark when I reached the house, but I wanted it that way. Say, but when I knocked on the front door of that house, it was with fear and trembling. "Is this Mr. Quarternight?" inquired a very affable lady who received me. I knew I was one of old man Quarternight's 7 boys, and admitted that that was my name, though it was the first time anyone had ever called me Mr. I was welcomed, ushered in, and introduced all around. There were a few small children whom I knew, so I managed to talk to them. The girl whom I was being braced against was not a particle overrated, but sustained the Kentucky reputation for beauty. She made herself so pleasant and agreeable that my fears soon subsided. When the man of the house came in, I was cured entirely. He was gruff and hearty, opened his mouth and laughed deep. I built right up with him. We talked about cattle and horses until supper was announced. He was really sorry I hadn't come earlier, so as to look at a 3-year-old colt that he set a heap of store by. He showed him to me after supper with a lantern. Fine colt, too. I don't remember much about the supper, except that it was fine, and I came near spilling my coffee several times. My hands were so large, and my coat sleeves so short. When we returned from looking at the colt, we went into the parlor. Say, fellows, it was a little the nicest thing that I ever went against. carpet that made you think you were going to bog down every step, springy like marshland, and I was glad I came. Then the younger children were ordered to retire, and shortly afterward the man and his wife followed suit. When I heard the old man throw his heavy boots on the floor in the next room, I realized that I was left all alone with their charming daughter. All my fears of the early part of the evening tried to crowd on me again, but were calmed by the girl, who sang and played on the piano with no audience but me. Then she interested me by telling her school experiences, and how glad she was that they were over. Finally she lugged out a great big family album and sat down beside me on one of these horsehair sofas. That album had a clasp on it, a buckle of pure silver, same as these $18 bridles. While we were looking at the pictures, some of the old varmints had fought in the Revolutionary War, so she said. I noticed how close we were sitting together. Then we sat farther apart after we had gone through the album, one on each end of the sofa, and talked about the neighborhood, until I suddenly remembered that I had to go. While she was getting my hat and I was getting away, somehow she had me promise to take dinner with them on Christmas. For the next 2 or 3 months it was hard to tell if I lived at my boarding house or at the Brick. If I failed to go, my landlady would hatch up some errand and send me over. If she hadn't been such a good woman, I'd never forgive her for leading me to the sacrifice like she did. Well, about 2 weeks before school was out, I went home over Saturday and Sunday. Those were fatal days in my life. When I returned on Monday morning, there was a letter waiting for me. It was from the girl's mama. There had been a quilting in the neighborhood on Saturday, and at this meet of the local gossips, someone had hinted that there was liable to be a wedding as soon as school was out. Mama was present, and neither admitted nor denied the charge. But there was a woman at this quilting who had once lived over in our neighborhood and felt it her duty to enlighten the company as to who I was. I got all this later from my landlady. "Law me," said this woman, "folks round here in this section think our teacher is the son of that big farmer who raises so many cattle and horses. Why, I've known both families of those Quarternights for nigh on to 30 years. Our teacher is one of old John Fox's boys, the Irish Quarternight, who lived up near the Salt Lick on Doe Run. They were always so poor that the children never had enough to eat and hardly half enough to wear." This plain statement of facts fell like a bombshell on Mama. She started a private investigation of her own, and her verdict was in that letter. It was a center shot. That evening when I locked the schoolhouse door, it was for the last time, for I never unlocked it again. My landlady, dear old womanly soul, tried hard to have me teach the school out at least, but I didn't see it that way. The cause of education in Kentucky might have gone straight to eternal hell before I'd have stayed another day in that neighborhood. I had enough money to get to Texas with, and here I am. When a fellow gets it burnt into him like a brand that way once, it lasts him quite a while. He'll feel his way next time. "That was rather a raw deal to give a fellow," said Officer, who had been listening while playing cards. "Didn't you ever see that girl again?" "No, nor you wouldn't want to either if that letter had been written to you. And some folks claim that 7 is a lucky number. There were 7 boys in our family, and nary one ever married." "That experience of Fox's," remarked Honeyman, after a short silence, "is almost similar to one I had. Before Loveland Flood adopted me, I worked for a horseman down on the Nueces. Every year he drove up the trail a large herd of horse stock. We drove to the same point on the trail each year, and I happened to get acquainted up there with a family that had several girls in it. The youngest girl in the family and I seemed to understand each other fairly well. I had to stay at the horse camp most of the time, and in one way or another did not get to see her as much as I would have liked. When we sold out the herd, I hung around for a week or so and spent a month's wages showing her the cloud with the silver lining. She stood it all easy, too. When the outfit went home, of course, I went with them. I was banking pretty strong, however, the next year, if there was a good market in horses, I'd take her home with me. I had saved my wages and rustled around, and when we started up the trail next year I had 40 horses of my own in the herd. I had figured they would bring me $1,000, and there was my wages besides. When we reached this place we held the herd out 20 miles, so it was some time before I got into town to see the girl. But the first time I did get to see her, I learned that an older sister of hers, who had run away with some renegade from Texas a year or so before, had drifted back home lately with tears in her eyes and a big fat baby boy in her arms. She warned me to keep away from the house, for men from Texas were at a slight discount right then in that family. The girl seemed to regret it and talked reasonable, and I thought I could see encouragement. I didn't crowd matters, nor did her folks forget me when they heard that Byler had come in with a horse herd from the Nueces. I met the girl away from home several times during the summer, and learned that they kept hot water on tap to scald me if I ever dared to show up. One son-in-law from Texas had simply surfeited that family. There was no other vacancy. About the time we closed out and were ready to go home, there was a cattleman's ball given in this little trail town. We stayed over several days to take in this ball, as I had some plans of my own. The girl was at the ball all easy enough, but she warned me that her brother was watching me. I paid no attention to him and danced with her right along, begging her to run away with me. It was obviously the only play to make. But the more I swayed her, the more she'd fuse. The family was on the prod bigger than a wolf, and there was no use reasoning with them. After I had had every dance with her for an hour or so, her brother coolly stepped in and took her home. The next morning he felt it his duty, as his sister's protector, to hunt me up and inform me that if I ever spoke to his sister again, he'd shoot me like a dog. "Is that a bluff, or do you mean it for a real play?" I inquired politely. "You'll find that it will be real enough," he answered angrily. "Well, now, that's too bad," I answered. "I'm really sorry that I can't promise to respect your request, but this much I can assure you. Any time that you have the leisure or want to shoot me, just cut loose your dog, but remember this one thing, that it will be my second shot." "Are you sure you wasn't running a blazer yourself, or is the wind merely rising?" inquired Durham, while I was shuffling the cards for the next deal. "Well, if I was, I hung up my gentle honk before his eyes and ears and gave him free license to call it. The truth is, I didn't pay any more attention to him than I would to an empty bottle. I reckoned the girl was all right, but the family were these razor-backed barnyard savages. It makes me hot under the collar yet when I think of it. They'd have lawed me if I had, but I ought to have shot him and checked the breed." "Why didn't you run off with her?" inquired Fox dryly. "Well, of course a man of your nerve is always capable of advising others, but you see, I'm strong on the breed. Now a girl can't show her true colors like the girl's brothers did, but get her in the harness once, and then she'll show you the white of her eye, balk, and possibly kick over the wagon tongue. No, I believe in the breed. Blood'll tell." "I worked for a cowman once," said Bull irreverently, "and they told it on him that he lost $20,000 the night he was married." "How, gambling?" I inquired. "No, the woman he married claimed to be worth $20,000, and she never had a cent. Spades trump." "No hearts?" replied the rebel. "I used to know a foreman up in DeWitt County, Honest John Glenn they called him. He claimed the only chance he ever had to marry was a widow, and the reason he didn't marry her was he was too honest to take advantage of a dead man." While we paid little attention to the wind or weather, this was an ideal night, and we were laggard and seeking our blankets. Yarn followed yarn, for nearly every one of us, either from observation or from practical experience, had a slight acquaintance with the great mastering passion. But the poetical had not been developed in us to an appreciative degree, so we discussed the topic under consideration much as we would have done horses or cattle. Finally the game ended. A general yawn went the round of the loungers about the fire. The second guard had gone on, and when the first rode in, Joe Stallings, halting his horse in passing the fire, called out sociably, That muley steer, the white 4 year old, didn't like to bed down amongst the others, so I let him come out and lay down by himself. You'll find him over on the far side of the herd. You all remember how wild he was when we first started. Well, you can ride within 3 feet of him tonight, and he'll grunt and act sociable and never offer to get up. I promised him that he might sleep alone as long as he was good. I just love a good steer. Make down our bed, partner. I'll be back as soon as I picket my horse." End of chapter 6.